All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lychee. I'm one of the organizers for this year's Quantitative Seminar series for the Pont Lab. We'll start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all bands and tribes in the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Our lab also acknowledges that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. And now I will introduce our speaker today. If I can find, yes, okay. So Matt is a third-year PhD student in the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which is based in Juneau. Matt is advised by Dr. Curry Cunningham, and his current research interest focuses on advancing and developing stock assessment methods. Matt is originally from Hong Kong and got his undergrad degree at the University of New Hampshire, where he studied marine, estuarine, and freshwater biology. Beyond his research, Matt enjoys fishing, running, and touching real fish, which is not something our lab can all claim. Yeah, over to you, Matt. Thank you for agreeing to speak and look forward to hearing about your research.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about some of my ongoing work. So looking at confronting these changes within our fishery stock assessments, and I'll dive into some sablefish case studies and then hoping to generalize this a little with some simulations I've been doing. If you guys weren't here earlier, feel free to interrupt and sort of discuss while I'm talking. So before I begin, my lab mate is actually defending in about an hour, and he's looking at intercalibrating survey indices across Alaska. So if you guys are interested in that, you should go to that right after this. So just to orient us, I have a little bit of a roadmap here. I'll go through some motivation as to why we started out this work, and then I'll go through some basics of what a contemporary stock assessment is going to look like, specifically focusing on what we term as selectivity and fleet structure. I'll then dive into the sablefish case study and then provide some hopefully helpful insights from simulation work, and then end with some general conclusions and perhaps some preliminary good practices. So in terms of the motivation for my talk today, it's Alaska sablefish, and it's extremely economically valuable, extremely delicious as well. And historically, the fishery has been targeted using hook and line gear. But in recent years, we've had this rapid transition towards the use of pot gear across the Gulf of Alaska, which was facilitated by this regulatory change in response to sperm whale depredation. And so in addition to this rapid adoption of this new gear type, there's also been these recent high recruitment events that's coincided with that. So here I have a figure to the bottom right there. So it's just a time series, and then we have the black line is total recruitment. So as you can see, in recent years, we've had these extremely high recruitment events, and coinciding with that, we've had total removals resulting from this pot gear increased rapidly while the traditional hook and line gear has sort of decreased. And so we've had this rapid change in fleet structure, and given these changes as analysts, we really try to figure out how we want to account for and deal with these changes within our assessment models and management practices, given that much of sort of this Western fisheries management is based upon the insights we gain from our assessment models. So the point of fisheries management, I got a little lazy, so I took this right off of the NOAA website, is to sustain, protect, and increase this domestic seafood supply, to maintain and enhance recreational and subsistence fishing opportunities, protect ecosystem health and sustainability, and then create jobs, support related economic and social benefits, as well as sustain community resilience. And as you can infer, to achieve all of the above, we typically develop recommended harvest levels using our stock assessment models. And so it's really imperative that we get these processes correct within our models in order to get somewhat robust management reference points and recommendations for harvest. Now, I won't bore you with sort of the nitty-gritty of a contemporary stock assessment. I think a lot of people in the room are probably more familiar with those than I am. But essentially, we have model inputs, and then we typically have 3 submodels. In terms of model inputs, we have our observed data. So this is our observed catch to describe removals, our age composition data, length composition data, indices of abundance, etc. We also propose parameters that go into our submodels here. So one of the key parameters that I'll sort of focus on are what we call these selectivity parameters. So this cell sub and then this TASG is just time, age, sex, and gear, or we also interchangeably refer to that as different fleets. And so we propose parameters, we input these into our population dynamics or our state processes. And then we also input these parameters into our observation model, which generates our expected values. We then compare our expected values to our observed data using some likelihoods, adjust our parameters to minimize these likelihoods, iterate through this process, and hopefully we reached a converged model. And then we extract out some derived quantities from that. So these are our management reference points, spawning stock, biomass, etc. Now, diving into what selectivity is, essentially it's the probability of capturing an individual given length or age, and this will be the sort of main focus of my talk today, that and fleet structure. And so we typically represent selectivity with functional forms, so logistic, gamma, or double normal. And here are some examples of those shapes and what they might look like. So you'll see a lot of selectivity curves throughout. So I think most will be familiar with this format. So we typically think of selectivity within stock assessments as a combination of 2 processes, right? We have gear or contact selectivity. So that's sort of this probability of capturing an individual if it comes into contact with our gear, and availability. So the probability of spatial and temporal overlap in terms of fishing activities with an individual of a given length or age. Now, interrelated with selectivity is what we term as fleet structure. So that's that G subscript or gear that we've been talking about. It's pretty flexibly defined. You can call it as different gear types or different areas. But in general, it's associated with fleet-specific data and represented under one common selectivity pattern. So in a hypothetical example, or sort of trying to motivate this example for sablefish, we have 2 different gear types, hook and line gear and pot gear. And so for each of these gear types, we might decide to define 2 separate fleets within our assessment model, each representing these gear types, and they'll be represented under their gear-specific selectivity curves, as well as their own gear-specific data, so like gear-specific catch, etc. And however, we typically define groups of vessels that share similar characteristics as a single fleet. And so this can be vessels that operate in the same area or operating using similar gear types. Or if we were omniscient, in this case, these selectivity patterns look pretty similar, and we would likely probably define this as one single fleet. And so that's what it would look like in terms of this black line right there. So we would combine data from hook and line gear and pot gear, and then model the removals as one single fleet, representing it under one common selectivity curve. And we might do this because defining a new fleet requires repartitioning out data and then increasing the number of parameters we're modeling. And I'm sure we've all seen this figure right there. With more model complexity, we're going to increase our variance in our model estimates, and we're really trying to find this sweet spot there. So while that's all in good, when we can sort of consolidate our data, increase the amount of information that's feeding into our estimated parameters within these single fleet or combined fleet models, there's really some other considerations we need to think about, as with every other approach that we sort of go through. And to motivate this, we once again have hook and line gear and pot gear, right? And suppose we treat this as a combined fleet. So during this early period where we have a constant catch ratio between hook and line gear and pot gear, and we're defining this as one single fleet, right? You might expect this selectivity pattern in the combined fleet to remain pretty constant over time. So this black line here is more or less the average of these two different gear types, and it's going to look something like this black line here. However, we know these fishery processes are dynamic and they change over time. So in a hypothetical example where pot gear begins to increase in terms of the catch ratio, and hook and line gear begins to decrease, we're going to see the selectivity curve to begin to shift. This black line begin to shift towards more of this red line there. So in terms of considerations within this combined fleet structure, it manifests in what we call as time varying selectivity, and we need to think carefully about how we account for these and confront these changes. So why even care about fleet structure or selectivity, right? Well, it's pretty important to get this removals at age process from the fishery correct. And misrepresenting these processes can cause pretty severe biases in our management reference points, which can potentially translate into overfishing or missed economic opportunities. And so as I sort of alluded to before, there's one common misrepresentation, and that's treating these fishery processes as static over time. And we know that fishery processes change over time, right? This can be due to differences in market demands, as well as changes in harvest practices, technological advances, or regulatory changes. And then getting at this availability aspect of selectivity, it can also be due to shifts in species distribution. So there's some ways that assessments tend to confront these changes in terms of fleet structure and selectivity. One of the first ways, or I feel like this is one of the easier ways, is to do these discrete time blocks. They're easy to parameterize, pretty parsimonious, but it's pretty unclear when a new period needs to be defined and when you specify these discrete time blocks, right? You're arbitrarily picking a time point in which you estimate new parameters for. But generally, we have some idea of when we might do that. So maybe something like a regulatory change. The other approach that we tend to use is this continuous time varying selectivity or process. And here it's just a simple time series model. So your auto-regressive one models or some random walk. And so the pros here, it's less subjective, but some potential cons are it's increased model complexity as well as potential variability in your reference points and model estimates in general. And the last approach that I think is a little bit less common, perhaps maybe a little more case specific, is disaggregating this fleet structure within the context of a combined fleet. So the pros are it's less subjective, pretty easy to define different gear types in this context, and it allows for fleet specific projections as well as enhanced model diagnostics. But once again, increases this model complexity with the addition of a new model dimension. So the current state of knowledge in terms of fleet structure with respect to different gear types, I would say, is pretty sparse. There's a couple of studies that's touched explicitly on fleet structure. So there, Pun et al. 2014 sort of defined this best practice in terms of defining a maximum number of fishery fleets and then consolidating the number of fleets afterwards. And more recently, we've had this paper come out from Anders Nielsen, where basically they found that multi-fleet models can mimic the dynamics of single fleet models. And when you have these slow changes in fishery fleet structure, these continuous non-parametric time varying selectivity approaches can sort of approximate these. I will note there's quite a bit of work on fleet structure in terms of areas as fleets, but in terms of that spatial aspect, but I won't really touch on it. We'll mainly focus on these different gear types here. So sablefish is a prime case study to sort of expand upon our knowledge in terms of fishery fleet structure and how we confront these rapid changes in gear usage. So we've had this rapid change in fleet structure. We've had total removals almost surpass that of hook and line gear in a little under 5 years, which is, I think, pretty unprecedented. And right now, we're not really sure how to account for these changes, right? So the current approach we do is we have a directed fishery. So we're going to combine the hook and line gear and pot gear and model it as a single fleet, while time blocking selectivity in 2017 to account for this regulatory shift. The potential alternative that I'm going to explore and we're going to dive into is potentially disaggregating this fleet structure here. So the objectives here are to compare our model variants and investigate some implications of adding a new pot fishery fleet, the assumptions regarding this pot fleet selectivity, so whether it's logistic, flat-topped, or dome-shaped, and sort of evaluate the appropriateness of time block selectivity. In terms of our study design, we'll evaluate our models based on model fit, some key management quantities, and using some expert judgment in terms of sort of process-based research, our knowledge about the fishery, as well as biological dynamics. And so these are the three different models I'll be comparing. So here we have our combined logistic, which is our status quo model. We have a combined fleet structure, so we're combining hook and line gear and pot gear data, and then representing it under one common selectivity curve. And we'll be assuming logistic selectivity here, so looks something like that in the blue. And then we'll assume this time block selectivity in 2017 to account for this regulatory change. We then also have this pot logistic model there. So here we have a disaggregated fleet structure. We're independently modeling this hook and line gear and pot gear, where each of these gear types have their own independent selectivity curves. And for the pot gear here, we'll be assuming logistic selectivity, but no time variation there, because we'll make the brave assumption that we've sort of dealt with this by disaggregating the fleet structure. And the third model is this pot gamma model. So once again, this disaggregated fleet structure, but assuming gamma selectivity, so this dome-shaped selectivity. And the reason we're looking at these different selectivity curves is just we don't have a good idea of what this new emerging pot fishery selectivity might look like. And no time variation in selectivity again. And you might notice that we didn't have any continuous time varying selectivities here, or selectivity models here. So this AR1 or random walk approach, because sort of our previous explorations indicated that these would be pretty unstable, so we didn't evaluate it further. And you really need to consider this sex structure within the assessment, right? If we have this continuous time varying process, we're going to have deviations in both the males and the females, and that gets a little unwieldy in terms of how the model deals with it. Yeah, so why gamma? Well, as I alluded to before, not a lot known about what that selectivity curve might look like. I think there's also something to be said about try everything that might work and then let the data tell the story. I also tried a bunch of other selectivity forms that didn't work. So a double normal, double logistic, exponential logistic. I got really sort of had trouble sort of reaching model convergence, and really just unrealistic selectivity shapes that were all over the place. Anyways, we'll dive into some of the aggregated model fits to our composition data. So here in the row panels there, that's our pot logistic model, and then the columns are our different data sources we're fitting to. So just at first glance, this logistic selectivity doesn't tend to fit these data that well, right? In terms of fitting our age comps, we're severely sort of underestimating the number of young individuals removed and overestimating old individuals removed. And we see the same pattern for our female lengths. And for the male lengths, we still see some misspecification there. When we look at our gamma selectivity, it fits way better. Although I will say we're not fitting this descending limb that well, and not fitting this plus group as well. But in general, the gamma selectivity fits a lot better relative to this logistic selectivity in terms of aggregated model fits. So diving into some year-specific fits, right here, I'll just pick out 2009 and 2010, and then we'll dive into the other, we'll dive into more years. But in general, gamma tends to fit this these young ages pretty well, but not these older age individuals. We get this really strong sort of misfit there. Whereas for our logistic, we're underfit or we're underestimating young individuals removed, but then sort of overestimating a little, or we're not seeing these data pretty much in terms of older individuals removed. So logistic is sort of misspecifying that a little. Diving into some sort of year specific estimates, we see pretty general trends. Gamma tends to fit a little better, and but it doesn't fit this descending limb as well. We're not fitting this plus group that well either. And then for the pot logistic model, we're tending to overestimate these older intermediate age individuals that's removed from the population. So looking at some of the estimated selectivity curves for the pot fleet, this orange is from the pot logistic model, so right there, and then our blue is from our pot gamma model. And I think the thing that jumped out to me the most was we have this extremely strong dome-shaped selectivity being estimated for gamma. And I think when we look back at some of our model fits to our comps, it sort of makes sense that we have this pretty strong dome-shaped for gamma selectivity. And so we get a pretty similar pattern for females as well as males. And I think, I mean, me, Dan, and Curry sort of came together and we chatted about this, and we sort of came to the conclusion that, you know, there might be some cause for explanation in terms of why we might have dome-shaped selectivity, but we didn't think that it would be this extreme. And so we sort of dove into why that might potentially be happening and arrived at the conclusion that it's pretty suspect in terms of why. And I'll go into some reasons why, right? Well, one, we've had this recently, this new pot fishery recently developed. So here I have sample sizes for age composition. So just sort of pay attention to the numbers. And then the x-axis are from our different gear types. And so as you can see, sort of prior to this regulatory change, we have pretty sparse age composition samples up until this recent period. And we see a similar pattern in terms of our length comps. We have, you know, decent length comps early on, but then it really only started increasing during this recent regulatory change over there. And we have way more samples from our hook and line gear. And so one that resulted in us using these more inflexible gamma selectivity forms, maybe a double normal would, if we had a little bit more data, would estimate, you know, a less steep descending limb or even the gamma. So yeah, we have pretty sparse data in terms of informing selectivity estimates for this pot fishery right now. In terms of reason two, why we thought this was a little suspect. So NIMS has been doing some side-by-side comparisons in terms of looking at pot gear and hook and line gear with respect to this contact selectivity component of it. So here I just have some comparisons of size distributions between hook and line and pot gear. And these dotted lines are the medians. And on aggregate, you see that these pot gear tends to, you know, have pretty comparable size distributions selected. You might argue that they select slightly smaller fish, but you still wouldn't expect to see this extreme dome shape being estimated. And then this is just broken down by year and station on the column panels there. So pretty similar composition or distributions. But we do note that these are pretty limited experiments there. And going into my third reason why, we've had these recent high recruitment events coincide with this pot gear shift in 2017, right? So unprecedented high recruitment events coinciding with when total removals from pot gear really took off there. I think we had a question. The uncertainty of the gamma selectivity. Yeah, Cole, I'll definitely look into that after this. Thanks. Cole said to plot the uncertainty of gamma selectivity to see if the uncertainty is high at the old ages to corroborate that claim. Yeah, so we've had these high recruitment events. I'm going to write that down, sorry. Where was I? Yeah, so we've had these high recruitment events coincide with this pot gear shift in 2017. This results in this extreme demographic state that our population's in. We have these abundance of young individuals. And so in terms of our observation process, right, we might be potentially obscuring observations of older individuals that's being removed. And there's some sort of confounding going on in terms of this influx of young individuals, as well as this new gear type that's being sort of introduced into the fishery that's rapidly being adopted. So looking at some of our estimates of our key management quantities, in terms of our status quo model compared with our pot logistic model and our pot gamma model, we see pretty similar spawning stock biomass estimates in terms of both trend and scale across these three models. And then when we look at our sort of recommended harvest levels, however, we see that this pot gamma model results in much higher ABCs in terms of harvest levels. And this is likely associated with this extreme strong dome-shaped selectivity that was estimated. Essentially, we're not harvesting any of these intermediate to older age individuals that are the most mature. And so it develops into this cryptic biomass where it develops into cryptic biomass and a spawning refuge, and they're allowed to continue to contribute to the population without being sort of removed from it. So some preliminary conclusions there. It seemed like disaggregating these fleets had somewhat negligible impacts on our biomass estimates in terms of trend and scale. This could be due to, this recent just because of this recent history of the pot fishery. But I think sort of the bigger takeaway is that I feel like these multi-fleet models can sort of help validate our single fleet model assumptions in going through sort of Andre's initial recommendation. I think we should define the maximum number of fishery fleets that's feasible, and then begin to consolidate afterwards, and then sort of compare these estimates in order to figure out whether our assumptions are truly valid. Our assumed selectivity seemed to have pretty substantial impacts on our recommended harvest levels. I think based on that, I'm not making any recommendations, but I think most of us agree that model structure shouldn't really be based purely on statistical fit. And I think selectivity is one of those parameters where we really need to think about how plausible those shapes are, even if they are inherently unobservable quantities. And perhaps some sort of process-based research would be helpful, especially during this development of a new gear type. And then, yeah, finally, just some precaution is needed following these gear changes, right? So in terms of lingering questions, how do we tell a black cod apart from a Pacific cod? I think we need to definitely use genetics to do that. But I'm not, a biologist, so it's hard for me to tell. But all jokes aside, that landed way better during my lab meeting, but I think it's because people are muted.
You could have seen the looks that we gave each other in the room. It was so
Good job.
Yeah, it's unclear whether or not these conclusions are sablefish specific. We really need to evaluate the performance of these more continuous time varying selectivity approaches in cases where it is estimable. And it's unknown what these selectivity patterns among different gear types looks like. They're, as I said, inherently unobservable quantities, and we're estimating it. So it'd just be good to have some sort of reference as to why our models are doing what they're doing. So the solution there is to do this simulation study. I've sort of greatly simplified the details, but I've tried to hammer home some take homes in terms of the simulation. And I'm happy to discuss more about this as we go on. So in terms of objectives, one, do these optimal parameterizations differ based on the speed at which fleet structure changes? So whether this is fast or slow. In the sablefish case, this was a fast change in fleet structure. So we wanted to sort of understand, okay, are these time block approaches really adequate? And then what happens when we have slower changes in fleet structure, which I think is more common within a typical fishery. And the second objective here is to look at whether these time varying continuous selectivity approaches can account for larger differences in selectivity forms among gears. So if our hook and line gear has pretty different selectivities from our pot gear, can we time vary our way out of this? In terms of our operating models, which is the truth, we have these two axes. So the first axis is the fleet structure change in terms of the rate at which it changes. And then the second axis is these selectivity differences. In terms of the rate at which selectivity changes, we'll be looking at this fast change. So initially it'll be most of the removal patterns will mimic more of fleet one, and then it'll rapidly shift in terms of in the middle of the time series to rapidly look like removals from fishery fleet two. So we have a two fleet model. Once again, this is sex structured, and then we have a single survey fleet informing sort of these trends in abundance as well. In terms of fishery fleet one, we initially start out with a sort of younger selecting logistic curve, and then it shifts rapidly towards this older selecting logistic curve. And so this is what that might hypothetically look like. It'll at about year 25, it'll rapidly shift towards representing more of fishery fleet two. Just let that roll over once more. And in addition to this fast change, we'll also look at a slow change in fleet structure. So it'll gradually shift to look more like fishery fleet two over time, as opposed to this rapid shift. So you're going to see this black line sort of continuously or gradually shift more to look similar to this red selectivity curve there. To sort of add more contrast and make this a little bit more generalizable, we also looked at some more selectivity scenarios. So here we have the removals initially looking like, logistic selectivity for fleet one, and then shifting towards this older selecting gamma selectivity curve there. And then this bottom panel is the case where we have the most selectivity differences, I would say. We start out with this logistic selectivity, and then it shifts backwards to select, or shifts to the left to select even younger individuals with a more extreme dome shape there. And then, yeah, this is a full factorial. So we have 6 operating models, and then we're going to apply all our estimation models to these. Now, in terms of estimation models that I'll present here, we have our matched operating model, just to sort of serve as a basis of comparison and just to make sure that everything's working correctly. And then we have 2 models that's of this single fleet time blocked flavor. In this initial time period, or in the first time period prior to this change in fleet structure, we'll define logistic selectivity. And then in the second time period, we'll also define logistic selectivity. And this new time block will be defined right when this fleet structure change happens, just because we're omniscient and we know sort of when this happens. We did do some sensitivity runs looking at misspecifying this time block, and we can talk about that if we want to later on. Now, the second sort of time block variant we looked at was initially it'll be a logistic selectivity, but in the second time block, we have the flexibility to determine potentially another selectivity pattern. And so we looked at this sort of gamma dome shape there. And then in terms of our random walk selectivity models, this is a one fleet model. We have this logistic random walk, so it's going to stay logistic but change throughout the entire time series continuously. We also have this gamma random walk that's going to change continuously throughout the time series, but as this dome shape selectivity. And yeah, here we just apply all our estimation models to our operating models and see what turns up. Just briefly to orient us, because I'm going to throw up a 12 panel plot. this is sort of what we're going to be looking at. We have our relative error in spawning stock biomass. So ideally, what you want to see if a model does really well is this black line is really, really close to zero, and these simulation intervals are fairly narrow. If you see anything that's above this black dotted line hidden in the back, then you see sort of positive bias. You're overestimating spawning stock biomass, and anything sort of on the bottom results in negative bias. So diving into some of our results with this fast change in fishery fleet structure, I've overlaid these operating models in terms of what removals looked like for these 3 different selectivity scenarios, right on the upper right there, just to sort of orient us. Thankfully, matched operating models are unbiased. Presumably, there's no glaring bugs in my code. Great. Now, in terms of our time block models, I should mention our upper panels will be, or our column panels will be our sort of estimation models, and then our row panels will be our operating models. Looking at some of our time block models, they tend to perform generally well when, our one fleet logistic time block and one fleet logistic gamma time block are sort of applied to these 2 operating models there. So when we have a logistic shifting to a logistic, or a logistic shifting to a old gamma selecting curve. But we see this negative bias when we assume logistic time block, but selectivity or removal patterns actually shifts from logistic to a more extreme dome-shaped selectivity towards younger individuals. And I'll touch a little bit on why that's happening in the next slide there. But the general takeaway here is that these time block models seem to account for this fast change in fishery fleet structure pretty well if we can correctly define when this happens. In terms of our random walk models, they tend to also perform fairly well across all these scenarios, except for when, this one fleet logistic random walk model is applied to this is applied to an operating model where it shifts from logistic selectivity to a younger selecting gamma dome shaped selectivity. But we also saw some lower convergence rates relative to our other models. Our other models tended to have about 100% convergence. And I think this is likely because we're estimating deviations for both females and males. And so our model has sort of a hard time figuring out what to do with this pretty complex model there. And there's a lot of parameter correlations going on, et cetera. And so this is what the full panel sort of looks like. Hopefully I went through that slow enough. So diving into why these single fleet models with time block selectivity struggled with these larger differences in selectivity, right? These 2 model variants when they were applied to this fast logistic gamma young case. Well, our logistics we started out with this initial logistic selectivity. So we're in this initial period, we're correctly specifying it. But then as it shifts towards this extreme dome-shaped selectivity towards this later period, when we once again continue assuming logistic selectivity, so asymptotic, flat-topped, these older intermediate aged individuals are assumed to be removed when they're actually present in the population. So we're gonna have some misspecification there, which results in this negative bias. But you might ask, okay, why doesn't this happen when it shifts to a logistic gamma old dome-shaped selectivity, right? Well, it's mainly because there's fewer older aged individuals left in the population at that point. So this misspecification really isn't that big of a concern in terms of bias in spawning stock biomass. So yeah, diving into some of the slow changes, we'll go through a similar format. So yeah, once again, our matched operating models are unbiased, but these time block models tend to perform pretty poorly across our scenarios when there's a slow change in fishery or gear structure. And I don't think this is surprising because, when we specify this time block, it's gonna take some average of the 2 time period, or it's gonna be like yeah, it's going to estimate some average of that new defined time period in terms of the selectivity. And so if it's continuously shifting in this initial time period, you're either going to over or underestimate what selectivity might look like. And then in the later time period, you'll also have some misspecification, which is why we see the patterns that we see there. But in terms of our random walk models, they tend to perform pretty well. But once again, similarly low convergence rates. And we also have, once again, the single fleet model struggling to deal with these larger selectivity differences. And this is due to the similar reasons as I explained in the previous slide. So I'll just start wrapping up here. Do these optimal parameterizations differ based on the speed at which fleet structure changes? Well, in terms of our two fleet models, it performs well under both fast and slow changes, but it's likely overestimating model performance because we're directly matching the operating model and the estimation model there. Now, in terms of our time block selectivity, it performs pretty well under fast changes, where in cases where we can really easily identify where this block should be placed, but not under slow changes. And then in terms of random walk selectivity, it performs well under both fast and slow changes. And this random walk gamma model actually does pretty well, right? I think our random walk gamma models have a little bit more flexibility in terms of representing different shapes. It can, get close to approximating a logistic selectivity, but a logistic selectivity can't approximate at all a gamma selectivity. So in terms of whether time-varying selectivity approaches can account for large differences in selectivity forms among gears or fleets, for time block selectivity, this approach works pretty well if you're able to, one, know where this change in fleet structure occurs, and two, if you know what the selectivity form of this new time period is, so whether or not if it's dome-shaped or logistic. If you can sort of figure that out or tease that out, then you can do a pretty good job of approximating large differences among gears. In terms of random walk selectivity, I think when you have these large differences, it's unable to really adequately reconcile differences among gears or fleets, unless if you have some more flexible form, maybe like gamma selectivity or some other forms like exponential, etc. And so I think that sort of suggests the need to disaggregate these fishery fleet structures under slower changes. In terms of general conclusions, disaggregating fleet structure when these selectivity differences are large is probably the most appropriate approach, I would say. In terms of time block selectivity, we can account for fast changes, but we really need to consider when it's specified and what form selectivity looks like after this new defined time period. And then in terms of random walk selectivity, it's more well suited for these slower changes. So just some preliminary good practices here. I'll steal this from Andre. We want to first define this maximum number of fishery fleets and then use model selection and diagnostics to identify this gear or fleet specific selectivity. So sort of our typical suite of model diagnostics. And then in cases where we have pretty similar selectivity patterns, so both are sort of logistic, then under slow changes, we want to retain this multi-fleet structure, or we can also allow for this continuous time varying approach. And under fast changes, we can time block with these selectivity patterns identified in this multi-fleet model if we have some good idea of when that happens. And then at the end, sort of iterate through this process, validate our estimates with our multi-fleet model, and keep going through our model diagnostics. Now, in terms of a more different selectivity pattern among these gear-specific fleets, under slow changes, I think we should retain this multi-fleet structure. But under fast changes, we might potentially be able to tease out what this new selectivity pattern might look like, and maybe time block our way out of it. And that would free up some degrees of freedom in terms of looking at other processes in our assessment models, whether this be like time varying growth or catchability or stuff like that. And then at the end, once again, validate our estimates with multi-fleet models in our traditional suite of diagnostics. And with that, I'll sort of end and acknowledge the groundfish observers that have provided these data, UAF, CFOS, and then sablefish harvesters and stakeholders, and my funding sources, SECOS and the GRFP. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions and sort of discussion.
Thanks, Matt. That was a great talk. Yeah, online folks, if you have any questions, feel free to post it in the chat or the Q&A. Okay, Jim has his hand up, so go ahead. Can you unmute yourself? Allowed to, okay. Here, you can unmute yourself if you want.
Hey, Matt, great talk.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Hey, it occurred to me on the, and maybe you said it and I missed it, but did you look at the performance of the block selectivity in a retrospective like performance? Like, I wonder if you have the slow and the fast. I mean, it sounds like it does better with the fast, but then if there was kind of a retrospective problem that might occur with in between those two, like maybe the random walk or time varying one would perform worse or better under.
Yeah. So I think I understand what you're saying. So we let me exit out of, are you guys still seeing PowerPoint or
Yes, we're still
but
seeing
not
that.
in presenter mode, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so we looked at, so sort of, I didn't want to show these because there's a lot of colors, but we looked at sort of estimating the assessment during periods where the fleet this fleet structure change intersected, when the transition ended, and then during this terminal period. So in terms of these, and so it's not really a full retrospective, it's more of, I don't know, we would call it a peasant retrospective, but in terms of when this fleet transition ends, we sort of get this positive bias there in terms of the fleet structure. I think it was about like 12% positive bias in SSB. And then, when we have these large selectivity differences, it was a negative bias. Whereas the random walk model sort of performed better in these cases where, in terms of sort of retrospective performance. Does that sort of answer your question, Jim?
Yeah, no, I guess that would, that answers the question. And if I understand your response, it sounds like a random walk would do better at avoiding a retrospective pattern, given that there was a change. Yeah.
For sure, yeah.
Thanks.
Could there be sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Ian asked if there could be an availability difference between gears. So in terms of depth distribution of pot versus longline gear. Yeah, I think I got asked this question during groundfish planting by my advisor. So I sort of looked into that, and they were pretty similar depth distributions in terms of pot versus longline gear. I think pots, I think they were pretty similar between the two different gear types, and it was pretty consistent across years as well. Yeah, but definitely good question. I think there's some like spatial stuff we're sort of inherently ignoring, or not inherently, but we're just ignoring just because it's so much more complex to deal with that. But yeah, that's definitely a consideration in terms of an availability difference between the gears.
I had another quick question. Nobody else? In the beginning, you said that the multi-fleet model could mimic, or the single.
This one?
Yeah, the multi-fleet model.
Yeah.
I guess it wasn't your conclusion, but multi-fleet model could mimic dynamics of a single fleet. I guess I always think of it the other way around. It seems like you'd want to be able to mimic a multi-fleet.
I think so. I mean, I sort of think of this as sort of, kind of vice versa, but I guess in this paper, I think SAM was initially, only single fleet, so they expanded that to accommodate multi-fleets, which is why they arrived at that conclusion of that multi-fleets can mimic dynamics of single fleets. But I think both ways of saying that is valid. But in terms of, the second bullet point, this was for, single fleet selectivity approaches can approximate these slower changes in a multi-fleet structure. Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah.
I almost wore my EDMB shirt today.
Oh, geez. I guess the other thing I would just add, on all the multi-fleet stuff, I guess stepping back is, I think there's a, coarser or finer resolution fleet structure is great, except when you think about management, being able to predict what the complex of catch will be into the future adds an additional uncertainty, I guess. And sometimes I don't hear a lot of talk about that aspect. It's always like, oh, we need more structure with fleets, but then when it comes to management, are you going to be able to maintain the prediction of what the catch will be among fleets and that kind of thing, and recommendations? Because you can have really big changes if it's a young fish fleet versus an old fish fleet and so on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, I think, like, in terms of just for the purposes of sort of having a stable assessment, like these more combined single fleet models are probably a little bit more appropriate, both in terms of, allocation decisions, etc., but also because, we're repartitioning out our data and increasing these model dimensions. And so, I think inherently these multi-fleet models are a little bit unstable, but I think having them as not as a management sort of operational thing, but as a tool to validate some of our model estimates can be pretty helpful, and sort of vice versa in terms of validating single fleets with multi-fleets. Yeah, definitely a great point though.
I have a question, Matt.
Go.
I'm not sure if this, have you considered, is there a way, I guess, to do the estimation of selectivity outside of the assessment model? Like if you had, like bottom trawl survey, length structure, like composition, have some way to compare them external to the assessment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of papers out there on that, but I don't really remember off the top of my head. I think it is possible. And I think Jane Sullivan actually she has a paper in prep on sort of like estimating selectivity just using comps outside the assessment. I think it's possible, and we didn't really look into that too much. I do think if we try to estimate it outside the assessment, we're still going to see this extreme dome shape selectivity, just because we're not observing that many old individuals sort of towards these older individuals right there, mainly due to sort of data limitations. But I think, that's a good point. I have to think more on that.
And also kind of related to, I'm not sure which plot it was. There was one that showed like age comps versus length comps, and you have a big plus group, right, in the age comps.
Yeah.
And it doesn't show up in the lengths. I wasn't sure if that, like, what.
Yeah.
That was about.
I think. Yes.
Can't remember which slide it was.
Is it this one?
Yeah. Yeah.
we have decent plus group, but not that many
Mhm.
old individuals sort of captured.
Long
So-
individual stays, yeah.
Yeah, so there's some sort of spatial aspects I kind of skimmed over, but the pot fishery was initially in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands prior to shifting to the Gulf of Alaska. And so the data from this early period all kind of comes from this Bering Sea Aleutian Islands fishery. And in about sort of 2010, like the 2009, 2010, and 2011, we saw this, saw a lot of old fish for some reason in the fishery. And I think that's why this plus group is showing up during this time. And we don't know why or what those fish were doing there. So that's sort of the plus group component of that. But in terms of why we don't see those in the length comps, I really don't have a good answer. I would sort of chalk that up to poor spatial coverage and sampling in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Yeah, I don't have a good answer, sorry.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? If not, then let's thank Matt one more time. And thanks everyone for coming today.
Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Say hi to Tristan. Tell him
I
you
will. Everyone go to his talk.
Oh, I need to copy the link. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation.